It's good to see you here. It's good to be here for Jill Talbot's craft talk. Jill's been here with us all week. She's been visiting classrooms. She's been working one-on-one with students. She gave us a tremendous reading on Tuesday night. That was fantastic. She's even been really good-natured about the rather impressive snow event we arranged for her here in central Minnesota. It's been a great gift to have her here with us. And would you please join me in welcoming Jill Talbot?
First of all, thank you for being here. Let me get my do not disturb on my phone. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, all right. So what I want to talk about today is kind of a two-parter, but I'll start with an anecdote about when I respond to student experiments, and that's what I call them for the weekly experiments that my students do, because I do want to emphasize that we are experimenting and writing consistently. And one of the things that I often, all of my comments for my students are in the form of questions to provide them with agency about making decisions in their own work and avoiding being prescriptive in my feedback, letting them make their own choices, but then asking them to pay attention if there are certain questions that keep showing up in your experiments. Recognize that this is something that you keep failing to include, right? Things, details, description, images that are important for the reader. And one of those has to do with portraiture and how we write. And while this is geared toward writing essays, it's also applicable to all genres, right? But sometimes I'll write in the margin, can we see this person, right? Or I want to know this person, right? And that means giving readers enough details in various ways, which I'm going to share with you today, but in thinking about how we create portraiture in writing, but then also, particularly with there are different terms for the I, capital I, letter I in essay writing, the I character. I use the term persona, but we're going to do a balance today of portraiture and persona, and any element that I am including here about using certain elements to describe other people is also applicable when you turn that lens around to the self, right? And thinking about what the reader needs to know about the persona on the page. So without further preamble, I will begin. And I want to begin, since I have Joan Didion up here, who I referenced in my reading on Tuesday night, I want to start with this excerpt, which is actually portraiture, but in Why I Write, she explains that when she had the idea for Play It As It Lays, two images came to her. One was just white space, and the other was this description. So I'm going to continue with some excerpts from essays that offer very clear and inviting portraiture, and then I'm going to break it down into elements and then we're going to go back to some examples, and you're going to tell me what elements are in those examples. In terms of accommodation and accessibility, would anybody prefer I read the quotes? I just want to make sure everybody. Okay, I'll do it from now on. I just I don't want to. Yeah, okay. I don't want to bother people if they'd rather read it by themselves. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. Brandon had a snaggletooth and brown eyes that lit up whenever he joked around. He was always pulling faces, crossing his eyes, tugging at his ears, hiking his shorts up to his belly button. I responded to his antics in kind. The two of us would set each other off, screaming with laughter until we gasped for air. All right, so I'm going to begin with the common elements, and I'm going to go beyond what's listed here, but when we're talking about physicality, we're talking about the physical being. So the physique, the build, height. For example, I've had a graduate student who's been writing about a ex that she lost to cancer for 2 years, and when she was in my office about 2 weeks ago, she said, well, you know, Nathan was 6'5". And I said, I never knew that. That seems important to me, right? So height, hair, that can mean, you know, the color or the texture, right? Long or curly or short. And then when we're talking about age and age range, it can be, you know, a 20-something, right? Or he was in his early 40s, or when she was in 6th grade, right? Or 2 years after graduating high school. So there are, you know, an infinite number of ways to do these. Now, I want to point out as we're going through them, I'm starting with the most common ones that are used in writing and then kind of moving on to some other options. But these are all options. Right? So I'm giving you a wealth of elements to pick and choose from in your own writing. So clothing, when I read about clothing items in any genre, I'm thinking about a unique piece of clothing, right, that would stand out in the reader's mind versus someone's uniform, something that they wore all the time, right? Or a particular style of clothing that would help define the person. And then accessories, belts, for example, or earrings, or kind of purse or bag or backpack that someone's wearing. And then race or ethnicity as well, to clarify that. And at any point that if you want me to go into more detail or ask a question, if you can make yourself a note to come back to a particular slide at the end, that would be great. Gestures. So a gesture that someone does often, right? If someone always like waves wildly, right? Or if someone, you know, I often think of gestures and habits as kind of intertwined, right? Because someone can have a gesture that is a habit, right? So if someone, you know, talks with their hands, right? That's a gesture, but it's also a habit, right? But in thinking about habits too, we can talk about good habits, we can talk about less healthy habits, right? Or a habit that has ceased, right? So I'm kind of making all these allusions because we're going to see examples of all of these eventually. But the next one is talents, and this can be something that is related to a musical ability or a penchant for drawing, but it can also be, if you are familiar with the film The Breakfast Club, there is a scene in which everybody in detention that morning goes around talking about their unique talent. And Claire's, played by Molly Ringwald, anybody remember what it is?
Oh my gosh, no, sorry, I had it in it.
Okay.
I had it, Jill, and it went away.
Anybody else remember it?
Putting on lipstick?
She can put on lipstick.
Putting the
Yeah, she puts the
cleavage.
lipstick in her cleavage, right, and then puts on the lipstick. Right? Yeah. So it can be something that is more profound, like I mentioned, like a musical prodigy, but it can also be a unique talent, right? Because what we're after is portraiture that stays with the reader, right? So that they have an image that they can access, and it invites them into the writing more. With dialogue, this can be an expression that the person used or uses often, right? Or an expression they use in a particular situation or context. But it can also be memorable, right? Like a particular word of advice or a response at some point, or a parting sentiment, right? So, and with dialogue, I want to add something that's not there, but is so important, is any kind of inflection, accents, intonations that someone has in the way that they talk, right? That can either reveal where they are from or can allow sensory detail, right? So that the reader can actually hear them speaking. This one, the next one, How Others See the Person, is actually from a former student who once asked me, could we use the way other people view or think about that person as an element of portraiture? Of course, right? Absolutely. Because if we take an attitude or an assumption, or let's say somebody who has a certain mythology to them, right? That can certainly help create the aura of that person. Comparing and contrast the persona, the self, with the person, right? So I'm going to shift to fiction real quick. So thinking about, particularly with the Nick Carraway and Jay Gatsby, right? Often that contrast between the two of them through the perspective, right, of Carraway, so we understand, and you can see like how others see that person, how that factors into Gatsby's mystique, right? But is setting oneself either apart and distinct, or setting that person, right, apart and distinct from the character, the narrator, or the persona. And the environment, this can be all of these things, right? The region, I'll add the country, the particular state. When, for a state like Texas, for example, it's often needs to be more specific, right? Because it's so large and the regions are so diverse. And when I say home, I mean the kind of home, right? So I have another student who has been writing essays about growing up in a double-wide trailer, and how that impacted her upbringing, how it was endemic to the particular region in Pennsylvania where she was growing up, but also how that impacted the ways in which her fellow students when she was growing up, her classmates, thought about her just based on that one fact of environment, right? Occupation is always a good one. I think particularly when, it's an effective one when the person no longer has that occupation. So writing about, let's say, a grandfather, like if I'm writing about my grandfather, and I'm writing about how he was a Methodist minister, right, in the North Texas region, and then using that to kind of shade everything else that I might talk or describe about him, right, about the occupation. Okay. So let's look at, to me, this is one of the finest examples in all of personal essay land from Ryan Van Meter, who is, with each essay that he writes, he offers a masterclass in portraiture. It is one of his many strengths as a writer, but you're going to see many examples from him, and that's why. Ben is the first brown-eyed boy I will fall for, but will not be the last. His hair is also brown and always needs scraping off his forehead, which he does about every 5 minutes. All his jeans have dark squares stuck over the knees where he is worn through the denim. His shoelaces are perpetually undone, and he has a magic way of tying them with a quick, weird loop that I study and try myself but can never match. His fingernails are ragged because he rips them off with his teeth and spits out the pieces when our moms aren't watching. Somebody always has to fix his shirt collars. Okay, which elements of portraiture, is it okay if I just disappear from the camera for a while? You're gonna follow me? I don't wanna mess you up. Okay. When I'm in class, I go to the back of the room. So, which elements of portraiture do you recognize there?
Clothing.
Clothing, absolutely.
Habits, the fingernails.
Yes, absolutely. Habits, right?
The perception, the external perception by another viewpoint,
Yes,
the first line.
yes.
Physicality.
Yeah, it's very strong in physicality, right? But there are also lots of details about the hair always needs scraping off the forehead. So there's a gesture that's a habit, right? Which he does about every 5 minutes. If we learn that his jeans have dark squares stuck over the knees because he's worn through the denim and somebody always has to fix his shirt collars, what might we say about young Ben here? And by the way, Ben is 5. That's established earlier in the essay that Ben is 5. What kind of kid is Ben?
Lower income.
Also
More
not
conscious active.
Active. Active?
not interested in his clothes, like with the collars or just.
Mm-hmm.
He also takes pleasure in evading his mother's gaze.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He also needs help with light breathing.
Is there an adjective that we could use for all of that? Let's see.
Careless.
What more? An adjective for a child.
Spontaneous. Perhaps not well supervised in some way.
It's not fidgety.
I mean, my mother would never let me go.
So it could be neglected, but I'm not sure if that's strong. Or just a little.
Distracted.
I'm not thinking of the word. I mean, I'm thinking of I had it in my head before I got here, but not disheveled, but it's another D word. But let's just stay with distracted. So if you are writing character line in a poem, right? And this falls into the category of showing and not, of telling and not showing, right? But my friend Ben was always distracted, period. Right? When I get a line like that in an experiment, I write, how so? Right? And so elements of portraiture can answer those kinds of questions, because what's in your mind about that distraction that word might mean something very different to a reader, right? So if we have these details, right? But to me, the dark squares, the D's, and the worms, the denim is that, and I have an advantage because I have the like the context. But later, we learned that Ben has a T-ball bat. Ben is probably sliding into bases, right? Or that kid on the playground, right, who's running around and sliding around, right? Yeah, okay, let's look at another one. Oh, sorry. Forgot the cue. He was my father's father, a farmer for many decades, a mandolin player in a bluegrass band, a leader in his basement church in a tiny town, a lonely spot in the otherwise blank northeastern corner of Missouri's map, and the man with the largest hands I've ever seen. What do we have here?
Lots of positives.
Occupation, including like past occupation.
Good? Yeah? Physicality,
Location.
right? Region, location, right? Good.
Talents.
Talents.
Talents, right?
Age, yeah.
And a leader in his basement church in tiny town reveals how he is perceived by members of the community, by other people, right? And then in a minute, we're going to get to another element of portraiture, which is a unique aspect of the person, right? And so Van Meter ending here, the man with the largest hands I've ever seen, right? That this is something unique to his grandfather. This is from the same essay, but this is the opening to the essay. My brother Garrett owns 3 cell phones, and he's talking on 2 of them as he speeds down a rural highway in the middle of winter. I'm older than him by 4 years and sit beside him with a plastic container of cookies balanced on my lap. I keep telling him to slow down his giant truck because he's not really paying attention to the road. He hangs up on phones and tosses them across his dashboard, and in the first moment of silence we've had in about 30 miles, I asked again if he's sure he remembered to pack the new shoes we bought him the night before. He remembered the new coat, I'm certain. I can see it hanging back there, but the shoebox isn't visible. Fuck yes, I already told you, he shouts. So before you tell me the elements that are here, I want to add 2 more. One is possessions, right? So his giant truck, right, is a possession, right? But the other that is so effective is the verbs that we apply to people we're describing. So what verbs is Van Meter assigning to Brother Garrett here? Speeds, right?
Tosses.
Tosses.
Shouts.
Shouts, right? And by the way, I'm happy to send links to any of these essays. In my classes and in presentations, I choose selections that are available online. So if you just Google them, you can find them. But what I want to say is that beyond the, I forgot to mention, I'm sure you saw it, but owning 3 cell phones, right? Possession, starting there, right? But the essay is about them driving to the grandfather's funeral, and let's go back to the idea of telling versus showing, if Van Meter had written, my brother Garrett is aggressive and loud, right? Or my brother Garrett is careless, right? But the verbs that are assigned to Garrett throughout the essay remain consistent until one moment when Garrett says something really beautiful about a flock of ducks. He's telling a story to the men from town, and the persona takes a moment to realize that his brother has done something beautiful with language, and he's not even aware of it. And there's that moment of, instead of frustration with the brother, it's admiration. The rest of the essay, all the verbs are much softer. Pauses, smiles, right? Waits, right? W-A-I-T-S. So even in the verbs, right, there's a shift to help create that shift in persona perspective. Yeah, okay. Let's see where we are here. My glasses out. Okay, I mentioned the unique one that we would get to. Another is attitude, and this can be mostly through stance or how someone carries themselves, right? So, for example, the way someone moves across a room can convey their attitude, right? Or the way someone stands or leans against a wall, that can also convey an attitude. And then also resemblance to a celebrity or a work of art. And so I think this is our last Van Meter example. This is from another one of his essays. The man in the Hawaiian shirt actually lived in Hawaii. He was on his way to an antique clock convention. The dome of his head was bald, but a horseshoe of white hair encircled the sides. He wore glasses and a giant beard. He resembled Santa Claus on vacation. So what elements do we have here?
The famous person.
Okay, yeah. Recognizable cultural figure, right? Yeah. Clothing.
The place where he's from.
Right. Actually lived in Hawaii.
Where he's heading to.
Yeah, potentially a hobby.
Yeah, could be a hobby, or it could be he owns an antique clock. It could be an occupation, one or the other, right? And then we have the physicality, right? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to stick with the theme of the men from town, and part of my, or one of my specializations for my PhD in literature is in film, and so I have found that using film language, and this is not going to be a big film lecture, we're going to look at 3 different kinds of angles, that's what we're going to do. But does anybody recognize the mise en scène, what film this is? Yeah, okay. So an adaptation of a Larry Murtry novel, Horsemen Pass By, 1961, Western, I think, starring the man in the tipped hat there, Paul Newman. So this is for any Paul Newman fan, but it's also in hopes to create new Paul Newman fans. Because get ready for some close shots of Paul Newman's face, okay? Okay. So this was the original film poster for HUD. And when we're talking about a long shot in film, we're talking about full body, right? So if we can think about elements of portraiture that we have here in the film poster and the character, what do we have?
We have like the
Attitude. I mean, that's it. Mm-hmm. Right? So in thinking about stance, it's also physicality, right? The cocked hip, right? And HUD is very cocky, right?
How other people see him?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fantastic, right? Right? What habit does HUD have?
Smoking.
Smoking? Okay. I mean, most people did at the time, but still, we got the smoking.
Also leaving women in awe, like.
Absolutely.
on the ground.
Fish and meal.
Yeah.
I mean, the man with the barbed wire soul, right? That's, that's a fantastic description, right? But we also have in the background there possession of HUDs, right? Is convertible. That is very important in the film, right? Okay, so let's look at some other stills from the film. Let's look at another. I would still consider this a long shot.
Gesturing towards something important.
So if you were writing this, right, and this is something else that I would recommend is scrolling through your phone for photos of people that you're writing about to spark your memory or to get an image. I meant to look this up earlier, but one of my students told me just this week that she has a condition in which if someone says, close your eyes and imagine an apple, there's nothing. She doesn't see that. So she uses photographs a lot when she is, photographs of places, photographs of people, right? When she's writing, so she has those images that she can access. But if you were writing a brief description, let's say 3 elements of portraiture to introduce HUD with just this image, what might we say?
The lean habit, the leaning.
Yeah. Cowboy hat, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, physical cowboy hat, leaning the elbow, right?
That kind of hooking in the belt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He's posing as a self-possessed figure, but he wants, it's a kind of come hither,
Mm-hmm.
like, let other people be attracted to me and approach me.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's postured.
Well, yeah, he's back, he's got his elbows out, right? Right, yeah. Also, like the belt is prominent, right? The belt buckle, there's going to be different belt buckles throughout the film, but yeah, so we have, it can be as specific, as the buttons of the Western shirt, leaning an elbow on his convertible with, the cowboy hat cocked just a little back, right?
Harsh sunlight.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And how the sunlight almost kind of cuts in diagonally, right? We can use those types of details in writing, right? I just almost went and took you all on a long digression about oblique angles in film, but I'm not going to do that today. Okay, here's the medium shot, which is the waist up. So this is the most common shot used in films because you can have people shot like dinner conversations, right? Moving back and forth between two. Shots of people in cars is often medium shot, but if you haven't picked it up yet, we're going to get closer and closer and closer to HUD. So what do we see here that we might not have been able to see in the previous shot? What elements of portraiture? Yeah. Like, HUD's thinking about something, right? And I'm saying, like, we can say that, right? HUD's thinking about something as he leans, a little leaning for HUD here, right? What else do you notice?
More in physicality, like how big his hands
Oh, mm-hmm. Your best word. Yeah, the veins in his hands prominent. Good.
are. His high cheekbones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How's the hat this time?
So just further back.
Yeah.
So you can see more of the space, but it's still like half in shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Into the crown.
Yeah, the widow's peak, right?
There's a brand sign on the fence post.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also struck, because you kind of see this in the last one, but about, I've been trying to figure out how to describe it, but the way his mouth is set, because it's not a frown, but it's absolutely not a smile. So there's a sternness.
It's kind of pursed. I think what I played with that too. It's sort of like the mouth's a little bump in some way, like pursed or something, but it's not.
And just that habit of staring, very, very staring.
Yeah, and the intensity of the stare, right?
He's not as impermeable as he was in the earlier one. It seems as though he's making some kind of implicit eye contact with an object of desire, perhaps. Certainly arousal of curiosity about specific.
And while we do want to always create a balance, right, of showing and telling, and not just outlaw telling, right? But I would also say that HUD is very comfortable in his body, right? He doesn't seem to be self-conscious, right? More confident than self-conscious, right? At ease in his body and the way he moves, including the way he lets a cigarette, right? What's a good verb for the way that cigarette is hanging in his mouth? Or the way he's carrying it between his lips?
Dangling?
Yeah.
I don't know, though. It feels like it's weirdly more like.
Or think about like the other time, like when he just had like the cigarette.
He's in control of that cigarette.
Yeah, like the way he was holding it, it's like, I mean, he's not a nervous smoker, you know?
I'm also used to thinking about the cigarette as something you keep in your fingers, right? And then you just bring it up temporarily. But he's comfortable with the burning ember just hanging out there.
Again, the hand in the pocket, right? Uh-oh, uh-oh. Okay, now we've got not just a close shot, but this is really an extreme close shot. So,
Is this the husband or is it HUD?
no, it's HUD. It's after a very, it's, okay, the context for those of you who haven't seen it is HUD is so drunk that tries to sober him up by dunking him into a water barrel. HUD has a drinking problem. In every other scene, he's got a coolers that he's drinking, so there's another habit, right? But what would we focus on here? Beyond just the perfection of his speeches.
He's still got like an intense stare.
Yeah, right? And so it could be, that could be also a habit, right? It never seemed that HUD lost the intensity of his stare no matter what he was looking at.
There's a clenched quality to his face there. It's almost as though he's bolstering himself in some kind of defensiveness, perhaps. Defending some kind of vulnerability.
But how would we describe that to the reader?
Yeah, how would you describe it? The fixity of the eyes.
A little clenching of the jaw.
Clenching of the jaw.
Clenching the jaw.
It's kind of simmering or smoldering.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, sorry. But there's also, I mean, there's a defiance too,
Yeah,
right?
defiance.
Like a I dare you quality.
Yeah, it's not really sultry. It's more, it's not dreamy either. There's a little bit of, I would say, anger, defiance, or something like.
And there's a water, right, or not knowing that it's water, so whatever, but it's water, it's running down his face in different places, and he's not wiping it. Right? He's just letting it
Yeah. Yeah.
Suppose.
Yeah, and so, thinking about, we could describe what we haven't seen before is like the curl, right? The curl of the dark hair, but I like the detail of the water dripping down the face and not wiping it away. Because most of us would, right? Yeah. Okay, now we're going to shift to look at some examples from literature. So this is from William Least Heat Moon's Blue Highways, fantastic nonfiction road narrative or travelogue, but this is also a masterclass in portraiture, this entire book, as he travels around different parts of the country, meeting people and talking to them. All right. A woman with a butter almond smile sat down across from me, her hair fresh from the curling wand, dropped in loose coils, the color of polished pecan, and her breast, casting shadows to her waist, pressed full against the glossy dress that looked wet. A golden cross swung gently between and high on her long throat was a small Pisces amulet. Her dark, musky scent brought to mind the swamp. We nodded, and she said in soft Mississippian, "You were very interested in Jerry's pancakes." Sorry, I don't know a Mississippi accent, but okay. Wow, is this description full of elements of portraiture? What do we have?
Musky scent. I guess it's yeah.
Well, it's add to the list, right? The way someone smells, right? That can, we can use similes there if someone smells like something or a specific cologne or perfume.
There was a previous encounter because of the pancakes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What other elements do we have?
Clothing and accessories.
Yes, absolutely. Clothing, accessories.
Their accent.
Mm-hmm. We get dialogue and accent. We get region, right? Soft Mississippian.
My favorite is the polished pecan.
Polished pecan, right? The physicality of not only the hair texture of loose coils, but its color,
Yeah.
right?
Fresh from the curling wand.
Fresh from the curling wand.
Just been done.
And where to go with that butter almond smile, right? Which I admire because it's not a, like, Heat Moon didn't take the easy descriptor for smile, but is tying it into like butter almond with pancakes and breakfast food, right? But butter almond smile, right? Really unique description there, right? Physicality with her breast, casting shadows to her waist, pressed full, the glossy dress that looks wet.
So
Pretty fancy for a morning roadside cafe, right?
the narrator must find her appetizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was thinking about that, like, we looked at verbs earlier, the hero lexical set, like the adjectives describing her and the nouns describing her are food related.
Yeah.
Her hair, her pond, her smell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's look at another one. And this is something that Heat Moon does in his writing. I really like it as a way to list a lot of things at once. So this is just an example of two, but oftentimes in the work he'll have like 5 or 6 there. Item. Okay, item. A woman, face as blank as a nickel slug, pulling beautifully on the slot handles. She had stood before the gear so many times, she herself had become a mechanism for reaching, dropping, pulling. Her eyes were dark and unmoving as if unplugged. The periodic jangle of change in the winner's cup moved her only to reach into the little coffer without looking and deposit the coins again. Item. A man moseyed in wearing leather from head to toe, attempting cow puncher macho. He looked more like a two-legged first baseman's mitt. With him, a bored blonde. I'm a very competitive person. I'm in it to win, he said. And the blonde yawned again.
Again.
It's really Whitman-esque with all those gerunds. That's what happened like 6.
How other people see someone.
Yes, the blonde yawns again, right?
Well, also he looked more like, obviously he's attempting.
He's trying this attitude, right? But really it's coming across, right? And that great verb, moseyed, right? The physicality, leather from head to toe, right? And the woman, right?
Habits.
So instead of saying a woman sat catatonic at the slots, right? But here we get more, like, we get the idea of how long.
Well, and I think that means we get physicality through actions,
Mhm.
which we haven't seen in quite the same way as in the other examples. Like there's a move motion of it.
It's actually occurring because of the gerunds, the INGs.
Mhm.
So in other words, we are literally not only identifying with objective sight, but we're participating in some way in a moment of perception.
And so we can assume this is one of her habits,
Yes.
right? But we're also getting gestures, right?
Well, especially that way, like that she knows that she can reach in to get for the coins without having to even
Mhm.
look at it anymore.
Without looking, deposit the coins again, right? You gear so many times to yourself and become a mechanism. Okay. I want to shift now to self-portraiture, and I crossed it off because I want to shift to persona. And I want to clarify the distinction. But I want to stay with self-portraiture for a minute and look at a wonderful example. I'm going to keep going for a second because I see we're closing in on time. But, so yeah, I think we might just end with portraiture and self-portraiture. But, okay, this is from The Voice of My Youth and a brief essay out here. So this is thinking about taking all of those elements and using it to describe the I. Little convenience store, stuck out in the middle of nothing, a stain on the carpet. I'm gassing it up, getting some coffee. My white shirt is gaping open and I have nothing on underneath it, but who cares? I'll never see these people again. What do I care what Alabama thinks about me? This is a new and unusual attitude for me. I'm practicing being snotty in anticipation of being dumped by my husband when I get back to Iowa. I swagger from the gas pump to the store. I didn't care if my boobs are rolling around inside my shirt, if my hair is a freaky snarl, if I look defiant and uppity. There's nothing to be embarrassed of. I bring my coffee cup along and fill it at the counter. Various men, oldish and grungy, sit at tables eating eggs with wadded up toast. They stare at me carefully while they chew. I ignore them and pay the woman at the counter. She's smoking a cigarette, so I envy her. Great day, huh? I ask her. She counts out my change. It is, honey, she says. She reaches for her cigarette and takes a puff, blows it up above my head. Wish I wasn't in here. Well, it's getting hot right a minute, I tell her. I've adopted an accent in just 4 weeks, an intermittent drawl that makes me think I'm not who everyone thinks I am. One of the things that I left off the list is context. And so I'm looking in particular at, in anticipation of being dumped by my husband when I get back to Iowa, that even though we have a swagger, a shirt gaping open, boobs roaming around, we also have a tinge of vulnerability, right? Trying to steel herself for what she knows is coming, right? What else is helpful here to help you, like, see this woman as she's gassing it up and walking into the store?
The adopted accent.
Mm-hmm.
I still can't quite process that. And you're going to draw the rest of that. I'm still thinking about all the permutations of that. makes me think I'm not who everyone thinks.
Exciting.
Students?
The region is really helpful.
The what?
The region is really helpful in establishing context, like Alabama and Iowa, you have ideas of this.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And verbs.
Mhm.
She's gassing, swagger, she's ignoring, envying, there's a lot of verbs that are limits about
Mhm.
physicalities.
Mhm.
And even all, and we have some very specific moments, sentences where we're moving into her telling, her thinking, which also I think adds this additional, right? Like, this is a new and unusual attitude for me.
Mhm.
And then the assertion, there's nothing to be embarrassed of, right? Because this is speaking to the self that establishes that, takes up like that vulnerability.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily see how other people see her, but she's imagining how other people are seeing her.
Mhm.
She wants another life, another identity in the last couple of sentences. The wasn't is priceless.
The what is?
The wasn't, the Alabama, and honey.
Wouldn't, yeah,
I mean, the presumed familiarity.
right,
of the South.
yeah, right.
Or the practicing in front of people that she'll never see again.
Yeah. Yeah. This one, unfortunately, is not online, but one of the ways in which this is an important moment with this bravado, right, that's happening here, and kind of who cares, right? And I also love the choice to say boobs, right, instead of breasts. But has anybody read this and can tell us what happens after this scene?
Isn't she like almost get driven off the road or something? Yeah,
Mhm.
she's a scary thing.
Very, very frightening.
Yeah.
She leaves and a car follows her, speeds up behind her and like is like telling her like he wants to kill her. And she knows at some point, like if she goes into this like one exit, that's it, like he's got her trapped, right? So there's this, kind of at ease moment here before everything gets really tense and scary and her vulnerability, right? But then, don't worry, the husband comes back and we want him to dump her because he could care less when she tells him about this story. He's like not even interested in hearing about her cares if she had this year assault or worse. We're at like 5:30 we end, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, you take a couple extra minutes if you feel like it. It's up to you.
I just thought that I would end with some examples of portraiture in my own work. And so I have just a little preface. I have a draft that I've been working on for a really long time. The working title is The Grandmother Archives. So I grew up in Texas, and I grew up with two very different sets of grandparents. I had my grandfather, who I mentioned before, Methodist minister, married to my grandmother, the preacher's wife, the one who directed the United Methodist Youth in Gainesville, Texas, the last town on 35 before you hit the Oklahoma border. And then my mother's parents in East Texas. My other grandfather was a cattle farmer. He did not allow my grandmother to work once they were married. He told her this. I did not know this until years and years later when I was growing up, but she was also an alcoholic. And so I'm working to write about that distinct difference, but also thinking about inheritance of what I carry from both of them. So this is the first one. Oh wait, hold on. Back. There's my selfie again. Okay, so this is, well, sure you can guess. Just inside the glass screen door, my grandmother carves a turkey with the hum of an electric knife before pulling a chocolate pie from the oven. An apron tied around her waist, bright lipstick, her welcome a soprano of sing-song ballads. So I have my grandmother with the actions that I associate most with her, and also I'm one of 2 people, living people, well my daughter too, so that's 3, who have that chocolate pie recipe. But the apron, right? The lipstick while cooking, and this was Thanksgiving dinner, right? So, and she, was doing everything, but still had the bright lipstick, right? She was the grandmother who went to the salon every Friday for the perm, right? And she slept with a piece of toilet paper around with the bobby pins to keep it in place as she slept. So that's just still portraiture, right? Trying to create image for her. Okay, this is my other grandmother. Sometimes my grandmother, her hair afrizz and her shoulders astoop, we perched on one of the brown leather stools at the counter, cartons of Pall Mall 100s by the fridge. Sometimes she'd be in the living room in a gold velvet chair, the drapes on the windows drawn, the room dark, the smoke billowing from the stand-up ashtray beside her. And other times I'd hear a loud clink from the back bedroom before the door opened and my grandmother shuffled down the hallway long after we arrived. She wore muted colors, browns mostly, her reddish hair permed, her lips a sharp coral, her voice an alto drawl, the East Texas of her vowels disgruntled dragging.
I love the alto drawl versus the soprano sing-song.
Thank you. And
The loud clink makes us want to know what's going on behind the closed door.
Different habits with smoking, but also sometimes, other times, this idea that these were recurring. That she was kind of just sort of listlessness.
I know a lot from environment, like the smoke billowing around, the curtains are all down, like the darkness, this atmosphere falling down the hall.
And so what I'm trying to do without, like in the essay draft, is juxtapose the 2 of them and let the reader figure out the differences. So like, if I go through the back door that opens to my Gainesville grandmother's kitchen, she's there in action, helping, like preparing things. She's doing things for others, right? Whereas sometimes my grandmother shuffled down the hallway long after we arrived, right? So it was always those awkward, like, well, is she gonna come out or not? But possessions, in her bedroom, she always had this, I always thought it was so magical until I realized what it was. I mean, it was magical to her in some ways, but a crystal decanter and crystal glasses. So that's what the clinks always were, was she was pouring herself another glass of Jim Beam. But I think that's all I have for today, and I don't want to take up your time. Oh, well, let's end like as a full circle thing about my dad, because I talked about him on Tuesday. So this is the last one I'll do, and then when? At 81, Dad looks about 65 and moves like he's 30. He still works as administrator for the school district, scoffing at anyone who asks when he plans to retire. Every weekday morning, he leaves for his office in a different sport coat and tie combination, my mother often snapping photos of him in the kitchen before he heads out the back door and drives the mile to his office. My mother keeps one of those photos on top of her secretary desk in the room where I sleep. In the frame, Dad smiles in a gray-blue jacket, a yellow, orange, and blue tie. Another photo in the living room, Dad in a charcoal gray sport coat, a pink and silver tie, his gray silver hair trimmed close. And in the essay later, I say that the photo of the charcoal gray sport coat is the photo for the obituary. So it comes in later. But my father, I'm not going to say it was a bit of a clothes horse, he was a clothes horse. He really liked ties. He had so many that my mother had a quilt made of some of his favorite ties after he died, and I have it, and I'm so grateful. It's just absolutely gorgeous, and she had his favorite tie put in the center, in Casablanca tie. It was his favorite movie. But everything I just said was portraiture, right? But when you went, oh, like that, when you do things like that and you let your reader know who you're writing about, they become just as invested as you are, right? And, you know, I've given mostly positive ones, right? But we can't write people as one-dimensional, like our flat characters in fiction, right? There's got to be ways. So while there are certain descriptions, right? Like of my grandmother, for example, there are other scenes in which she and I are laughing so hard at the kitchen table, right, that she goes into a coughing fit. Because we're having, like, she's telling stories, you know, about growing up or about my mother growing up. And so there's this balance. I always tell my students, when you're writing about someone else, take two disparate qualities of them and focus on those two.
Well, I see here the kinetic energy of your father in the first sort of segment, and then the second segment, photographs are inert, they're immobilized. So I was already sensing the funereal, just by the juxtaposition.
Yep.
And then the part, I know this isn't, it's kind of not about your dad particularly, but your mother often snapping photos. I mean, it's a picture, portraiture of the two of them together, right?
I mean, almost every, like, because she would, once she had a smartphone, she would text me, or before smartphones, she would email me the photos. But, yeah, and I keep saying last thing, but I promise it's last thing. One of her habits was, when they would go out to restaurants, which they did all the time, because, like, after I left home for college, that was a big part of their life, was going to restaurants in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. But she would take pictures of him sitting across from her at the table, and he would often be like elbows on the table and smiling at her. But those were around too. But she told me once, because he was 12 years older than she was, she took those pictures in case he died, and she could always feel like he was sitting across from her at the restaurant, looking at her lovingly. Isn't that sweet and sad all at the same time? And then after he died, I mean, I realized what a gift it was, because I could walk in the living room and there he was, smiling at me.
Do you still have those photographs?
I do.
Wow.
Thank you so much for being